that makes them feel good about themselves, that makes them feel good about the country, its military might, and so on and so forth. But there's another element to this. He wanted to project an image to the international stage that Russia was not isolated. That's why it was so important for him to have leaders from the global south, to have President Lula there, to have Xi Jinping there, and even Fico from the European Union, from Slovakia. That all showed to the world that Putin could not be isolated.
Russia has today staged its own, they claim, biggest ever Victory Day parade. I mean, you can already bring to mind exactly what that looks like. The parade rolling through the Red Square in Moscow to mark the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. But it has a different objective, showing off the Kremlin's military might, with a new fleet of tanks rolling across the Red Square alongside rocket launchers and ballistic missiles. All weapons used in the war in Ukraine. Well, a number of global leaders are in the Russian capital. China's Xi Jinping, Brazil's Lula da Silva, the Slovak Prime Minister's also there, the only EU leader in attendance, despite, you can imagine, hefty criticism from Brussels. Sergey Radchenko is professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the author of To Run the World, the Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power. Sergey, thank you very much for your time. Putin says this is the biggest ever parade. What's he trying to prove to the world today?
Well, he's trying to prove to the world that Russia is this mighty power that has, as he says, a great past. And as he just said a few days ago, a country with a great past has a great future. I think that was the main message. And this is the connection between the past and the present that Putin tries to draw.
80 years on. I mean, it's so remarkable how alliances have changed in that 80 years. Part of what President Putin was doing was saying, I want a 3-day ceasefire. So that actually finishes tomorrow. And he wanted that, in effect, to try and protect the parade, I think. And actually, it's political posturing and it's PR from him, isn't it? It actually isn't about a legitimate aim to end the war.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. This is all about PR. It's also about setting a ceasefire on his own terms, the kind of ceasefire that Ukraine would find it very difficult to agree to. Ukraine has called for an unconditional ceasefire, but Putin has attached all kinds of conditions, including stopping Western aid to Ukraine, which is clearly unacceptable to Kyiv. So for the time being, the war continues. I don't think we're very close at the moment to some kind of a ceasefire.
He's called it a special military operation. That's what he's called it for the entire time of this invasion. I just wonder, with an event like today, who do you think President Putin is actually persuading?
He's certainly persuading, or is trying to persuade, the Russian public. This was a show first and foremost directed at the Russian public, who love to see this kinds of parades that makes them feel good about themselves, that makes them feel good about the country, its military might, and so on and so forth. But there's another element to this. He wanted to project an image to the international stage that Russia was not isolated. That's why it was so important for him to have leaders from the global south, to have President Lula there, to have Xi Jinping there, and even Fico from the European Union, from Slovakia. That all showed to the world that Putin could not be isolated, and that's very important for him.
Absolutely. I mean, it's actually President Trump that's sort of drawn President Putin out from the cold of being this sort of political pariah. That relationship has been much warmer than I think people expected when President Trump was elected. It might have sort of slightly sharpened in tone in the last couple of weeks, a little bit of criticism from the vice president saying that Russia was asking for too much in ceasefire negotiations. But even in the last 4 months or so, that sort of global standing for Putin has shifted, hasn't it?
Well, it's been hit and miss with Trump. Trump is very unpredictable, of course. Putin would have loved to have Trump there standing next to him during this parade. But for this, I think a real breakthrough would have had to happen in Ukraine. And Putin is not ready to sacrifice his goals, his objectives in Ukraine just for the sake of a photo opportunity with Trump. But this is a relationship that he keeps working on. He wants to repair the relationship with the United States, regardless of what happens in Ukraine. And in fact, as Trump is starting to give up on Ukraine, or is starting to say, look, I cannot get these two sides to cooperate. Maybe we should just give up on all of this. Putin is hoping that this will not preclude a closer Russian-American relationship, including in the economic sphere.
How do you imagine this conflict coming to an end? It looks like Putin has got red lines in negotiations that he will just not budge on.
Painfully and slowly, I suppose. We will, the starting point for this is Ukraine has to continue resisting Russian aggression. If Ukraine does not do that, then Putin will simply roll over the country and impose peace on his terms, which would be complete surrender and defeat for Ukraine. Fortunately for Ukraine, this is not currently in the cards, mainly because Ukraine has proved so resilient at fighting back against Putin's aggression, because they have weapons, because they have Western support, which is why it is important for the West to continue providing that support as a baseline for any kind of future peace settlement. What I think will have to happen is that Putin will have to agree that he cannot achieve his objectives in Ukraine and settle for something less. Now, is it likely that Ukraine will regain its territories that it has lost to the Russian aggression? I think even Ukrainians at this point recognize that it's going to be very, very difficult, certainly in the short to medium term. But that does not preclude a scenario like in Korean War, for example, where you actually had a ceasefire in the end of years of fighting, and that has held for years and years and decades now.
What about the Russian population? You said that in part this parade is about persuading them of the might of Russia, but they also can see some of the realities, which is people not coming home, countless numbers of people dying, and extreme fatigue with the war. I mean, do you think the population will at some point soon run out of patience with this, as Putin calls it, special military operation?
Well, I think the population clearly has fatigue. The question is whether they have greater fatigue than the West or Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainians are fighting for their land, and the Russians are fighting for the land that their country saying is theirs, but in reality is not. And the economic situation is also problematic as well. Putin has avoided drastic measures so far, including general mobilization, which would make up for the shortage of manpower. Instead, has relied on high prices of oil to keep the war going, because he is able to make payouts to contract servicemen. So that is contributing to the kind of social consensus that we have in Russia, even at this present moment, which allows for Putin to continue this war. Will the social consensus fall apart if the economic situation worsens, or if Russia runs out of money to pay servicemen and will have to mobilize people? That's a very, very good question. I don't know how to answer it.
Thank you very much for speaking to us, Sergey Radchenko, the professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and author of To Run the World, the Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power.